Good evening, good evening. The Rebbe actually said, it actually makes me think of, the Rebbe has a very famous sikha where the Rebbe gave a very famous talk where he was explaining how there's lots of lessons we can learn in the service of God from modern science and modern technology, and we shouldn't be afraid of modern science and modern technology because, as Jews, because on the contrary, these things help us understand and appreciate godliness. And one of the examples that Rebbe gives is the idea of video or film, because there's an idea that it says in the Torah that an eye is always watching and an ear is always listening, which is about God, and of course God is aware of all our actions, and we should have the fear of heaven, and in the words of Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, we should fear God at least as much as we fear other human beings, that we're embarrassed in front of other human beings of our behavior, so we should be embarrassed before God, and bashful before God as well, which is very high level in fear of heaven. And the Rebbe said that from the time that the Mishnah and the Talmud were written, there was this idea that an eye is watching and an ear is hearing, but it was something that you had to believe more on faith, because you never see the eye that watches and the ear that hears. And the Rebbe said, back in the who knows what decade, the 50s, the 60s, the Rebbe said that nowadays it's very easy to understand what this means. It's not something that you have to take on faith. On the contrary, it's something that has been immanentized, that has been brought down and within our reality, that there's always, everyone knows that there's an eye that watches and an ear that hears everywhere. It's all bugged, it's all being watched, right? So God willing, we should only be as aware of God watching us as we are the silent watchers on Facebook who watch this stream. L'chaim. Last week was a turning point in the study of this discourse. We finished what's the main Haskalah section of the Maimer. We finished the section of the Maimer talking about godliness and the concept of Hani Avaya Lo Shanisi, the idea that from God's perspective, the act of creation, despite his active involvement at every level, and his active creation of the universe from nothing at every moment, the creation is not something that constitutes any true change in godliness. God, from God's perspective, everything is exactly as it was before the 6 days of creation, because all of his concealment is only self-concealment, and self-concealment is no concealment at all. It's all just an extension of the Ein Sof, whether he's revealed and concealed. And the things which appear to be separate from God, namely the creations that we see around us, the creation that has been made as a separate being, this reality is totally batul b'metzias, like the ray of the sun in the sun, or like the flight of the rock. It is something, as we explained in previous classes, that does not really exist separate from God. And in fact, really, if you really think about it, you can only say that the created reality is the Word of God. There really is no creation. There is no result of the process of creation. There is only the source of creation. Just like in the sun, there is no ray, there is only the sun. The way that the ray exists in the sun is as sun. So too, the way the something of the universe exists within the nothing from which it's created, within its source, it exists as nothing. So, in other words, in sum of the summary, very short summary of the many classes that we've learned already, the summary is that neither God's self-concealment nor the act of creation and making something that seems to be separate from him, good evening, truly makes something that's separate from godliness at all. On the contrary, the only thing that's really real, the only thing that's really here, even as the universe is created, is godliness, which leads to the famous what's the word? The famous piskam, the famous saying, the famous aphorism of the Frierdiker Rebbe, of the Rebbe Rashab, who said about these topics that the world says that without God nothing could exist. But I say that even with God nothing exists. That's true what the world says, without God nothing could exist. But the Rebbe says, even with God nothing exists, because ultimately a reality that is created, something from nothing, as we've been discussing in this class over many weeks, a reality that's created, something from nothing, is in fact not separate from its source in any way. It never achieves separation from what creates it, and is essentially not real, so to speak. It's not real in its own terms. It doesn't exist per se, it only exists as an expression of godliness. It does not have the English. The copies have only the Hebrew. If we printed the copies with the English, you got it up? Fantastic. Excellent. Well, we are going to be reading, so we started last week discussing the next section of our discourse after we concluded with all of that very profound, and for those who wish to review previous classes, I highly recommend it. They're all on the Shul's Facebook page. Some of them are on YouTube. I haven't put them all over on YouTube yet. The Shul's YouTube page. But the discussion was very involved, and we did it at the appropriate speed. We did it slowly enough that you can actually understand, I think, maybe not at the greatest depth possible, but at least every step of the discourse should be clear and understandable if you listen to previous classes. Now, that was all Eis Aleph and Eis Beis. That was the first 2 chapters of this discourse of the Rebbe Rashab. Last week we started the 3rd chapter. What does the Rebbe talk about after he has explained that essentially to God nothing has changed from the act of creation, that from God's perspective everything is exactly as it was before the universe was created? What do you say after you discuss all that? You answer the question, so what does that mean for us? How should we live now that we know this? And the answer is, as we began to explain last week, that when a person really understands this concept, and doesn't just understand it intellectually, which is one thing, but finds the reality of God within it, and knows that this is the truth, and not just a thought, but the reality that is true of everything in his life. When he looks at his table that he sits in front of, he has to know that even though this is a physical object that has been created by God, the nature of this object, if you really think about it, is not what it appears to be. God has concealed himself. God has concealed the true reality of this thing in order that we can return it to what it really is. As we discussed last week, God makes from nothing something, as the Hayom Yom says. Our job is to make from something back to nothing. Our job is to take, in a sense, in a very light sense, you could almost joke that our job is to destroy what God creates. In a sense, not really, of course, but in a more joking way, you could say that our job is to reverse the process of creation. God takes pure godliness, which is where everything comes from. Everything comes from God. This Judaism, monotheism, yes, everything comes from God. God takes godliness, and by concealing its nature, he makes a universe. Our job is to take this concealed nature and revert it back to godliness, or to remind it what it really is, as we said in the early weeks of learning this mimer, to remind the thing of its true reality, of its true source. That's our job. That's why God has concealed himself. So when a person really understands this, and he understands that the table, the physical object that's in front of him, even though it's a creation, even though it's something that in its very matter seems to deny that it's godliness, it doesn't reveal godliness in any way, it appears to be a totally independent reality, the person will become very dissatisfied with the reality in which they live. That's what we said last week, which is itself an interesting concept, by the way, I should note, because there are some people with a very, there's some people with a very shallow, almost childish appreciation of what a relationship with God, or with the reality of God, would look like. And they say that the only effect of godliness is tranquilizing. In other words, the effect of a relationship with God is meant to be that the person is always calm. That's all. Everything's 100% hunky-dory, everything's okay, God's got it, God's in control, God runs everything. And of course there is an idea, not exactly of complete passivity or calmness, but there is an idea, a profound idea of trust in God, leaving things to God, not worrying. But on the other hand, the godly life, as we learned last week in this class, introduces a whole new set of worries that are just as unfulfillable, maybe even more so, unsolvable as the natural anxieties of human nature, which pertains to what we're going to read tonight, God willing. So let me back up. Tonight we're going to discuss the two souls and the body. This is in this parenthetical that we started last week. So let's talk briefly about the two souls and the body in Chassidus. Chassidus says that every Jew possesses two souls. Now, much could be said even just about this fact. Why is it only Jews that have two souls? What does it mean that a Jew has two souls? Because we emphatically say that only Jews possess the second soul, whatever that means, right? Which is a very not politically correct thing to say.
Sick of political.
Everyone's sick of political correctness until they get offended. We're going to find what offends Ronnie, and then we'll see. We'll see.
Politically correctness offense.
We'll see. We'll see how true that is. L'chaim. You know, everything has its what's it called? In Mishlei. Is it Mishlei or Koheles? I think it's Mishlei. It's either Mishlei or Koheles, one of the two. Yeah. One of King Solomon's books, where he says, there's the famous chapter about a time to live and a time to die, right? A time to, which is it? It is Koheles, right? It makes sense that it's Koheles now that I think about it, because it's not really practical advice. It's very... it's not practical, right? Practical people say they hate political correctness. Impractical people say everything has its time, everything has its way, everything has its place. Anyway, it's very much connected to what we're discussing, right? Because this idea from Koheles, right, actually... I'm all over the place. L'chaim, 1 second. Let me focus myself. You like it? L'chaim, I'm focusing myself.
I like it too.
I keep drinking more coffee, and I think it's going to make me more focused. L'chaim. Okay, let's talk about the two souls. Forget Koheles. I could do that. That's its whole own hour. Let's talk about the souls. Every Jew has two souls, right? Set aside for a moment what this means for the non-Jew. The truth is that for the non-Jew, it's not as cut and dry as people assume, because people only really learn about this concept in Tanya, and we learn Tanya in a very simple way, and Tanya is very difficult to understand, and so all in all, we become completely flummoxed and confused. Rest assured that in many in other Hasidic discourses, it discusses how the difference between the soul of a Jew and a non-Jew is not structurally, so to speak, any different. There is just an additional dimension. It's a whole thing. So set aside that for a moment. It's not as non-PC as it sounds. Let's put it that way. Anyway, every Jew has two souls. There's a godly soul and an animal soul. The animal soul, when we say animal soul, we mean the human animal. Right? We don't mean a bear or a dog or a different animal. When we say animal, we mean the human being as an animal, which was a very progressive thing for Judaism to say. So, in a sense, because nowadays a lot of people think there is no difference between human beings and the animals, right? The idea that the human is an animal is a very ancient idea. Aristotle spoke about it. All the ancient philosophers spoke about it. And Chassidus does not argue. It is inarguable. Basically nowadays everyone agrees. One of the few things that I think everyone would agree with is that to some extent the human being is an animal, unavoidable, right? A human being has a biological life, right? The vitality, what makes the person alive as the human animal is called the animal soul. In other words, the soul, when we say, what do I mean by soul, right? The simplest way, before it gets very complicated, but the simplest way, when we say soul, we mean chayus, we mean vitality, right? What makes the person alive. At the simplest level, the difference between what remains after the person passes away and what's there when the person is still living. That some difference is the soul, because in the moment when the last moment the person is alive and the first moment after they've passed away, their body is fundamentally identical, more or less. There's fundamentally no difference biologically. The body quickly decays, of course, but biologically, in the last moment of the person's life and the first moment after they're alive, biologically, it stands to reason there's very little difference. right? In fact, it's hard to say even that some of the active processes of the body would have stopped. The person could technically still be metabolizing, the blood could be flowing, the brain could be alive, etc. And yet, not alive, the brain could be active, there could be brain activity that you could see on an MRI perhaps, even still, and yet the person is definitively no longer alive. Life is one of the great mysteries. Life is one of the things that no study of any matter has ever explained. Because life is an indivisible, unquantifiable factor. In other words, science understands everything through, for example, there's other ways of knowing things about the world, but let's use science as the example. Science knows things through observation and quantification and testing and experiment, right? None of these things is useful to answer the question, what makes the person alive, right? Because if the physical facts of the body are identical the moment before death and the moment after death, it's very hard to pinpoint exactly what has changed to say that this person was alive and this person is now dead. There's also other issues with pinpointing life. Like, for example, it's hard to say exactly what is alive and what's not alive, which also accords very much with what the Kabbalah says, which is that everything, a speck of dust, has a neshama, according to the Kabbalah. Everything has a soul, because even a soul of some kind, right? And so even the stone has a certain vitality, although much obviously of a very different sort than the human soul that makes them alive, which by the same token you can see that if even a stone has vitality, that means that even the human body when it's dead has a vitality, so to speak, right? In other words, the body is only ever as dead as a stone, and a stone is alive. So how dead is the body itself, right? The body has a separate neshama of its own, apart from the neshama that makes the human being alive. I know I'm giving you a lot of information all at once. The soul is the vitality. It's what makes the person alive. Life is one of the great mysteries. Life is like existence and consciousness and love, maybe. The great mysteries that no observation of things from the outside seems to be able to really explain, right? Without recourse to God, which is the great exception. God is the great explanation of the truly inexplicable core realities. Life, existence, consciousness, love, things like that. Anyway, pardon me for waxing philosophical, poetic. That's the animal soul. The godly soul is a different type of vitality. The Jewish life, one of the reasons, if I was giving a Tanya class, I would give the classic chapter 1 Tanya class, which is that one of the reasons that Jews are so crazy, Jews are totally meshuggah, totally crazy, which is, unlike life, something that can be statistically studied. For example, back when they were doing cult statistics, Jews made up like 1/3 of all cults in the United States were full of Jews, which is very, very strange for 1% of the population to make up 33% of the cults, right? Things like that stick out, right? Jews are weird. Jews are totally crazy. Jews are overrepresented in everything, in just about everything that they do. It's the famous line. There was a Jewish comedian, I think, who said that a Jew is just like a Gentile, only more so. It's the famous line, right? So one of the reasons that Jews are so crazy is because the Jew has a fundamental additional vitality to their normal vitality. In other words, by dint of the special relationship with God, the covenant with God made by Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, our forefathers, who created what we call the nation of Israel, right? Am Yisrael. Before the Torah was given, there was a family. That's really fundamentally what Yiddishkeit is, what Judaism is, a big extended family, right? It's a family with a family tradition and a family, the entire family is in a relationship with God, right? That's basically what Judaism is. Judaism is, it's a big family in a relationship with God, something like that. So back when our family was founded by our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the three of them had a very, very profound and deep relationship with God. And they were able, in some sense, through this profound relationship with God, to pass on this relationship to an extent to their children. In other words, or a different way of putting it is they took their personal relationships with God and made them a familial relationship, a relationship with Am Yisrael. Right, they're the people, a nation. This is one of the differences, by the way, one of the things that made Abraham special, because Father Abraham, even though he discovered God on his own, there were other people alive at the same time as him who also knew God. There was the famous yeshiva of Shem and Aver, right, where the different midrashim say that all of the patriarchs studied, right? They all studied in this yeshiva. There were these people that were aware of God, but what was the difference between them and Abraham? How come they weren't the forefathers of the Jewish people? The answer is that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were looking to make a consistent, perpetual people that has a relationship with God. In other words, they added a certain family or familial aspect that was much more profound than what you could learn in a yeshiva. Or to put it slightly differently, think about it this way. You know, people still go to learn from, wise men and religious men of all sorts of interesting religions. And they go to faraway places to learn from them, the middle of the jungle, the top of a mountain, ashram in India, all sorts of different interesting places that people go. Very rarely do they go there and they're adopted by the people that are there. I don't mean they let them stay. I mean they're literally adopted. They adopt them as children. Right? And there's a reason for that. There's a very simple reason for that. The simple reason for that is that if you have a very holy man, there is no assurance that his son will be as holy as he is. On the contrary, his holiness comes from, ideally, a lot of hard work and a lot of wisdom and a lot of effort invested on his part, right? In other words, this is something that you have to work for. Students are not born, they're made, right? So if you go to a master for a master-student relationship, or what's called in Hebrew a Rav and a Talmud, you're going to a rabbi. Rabbi is the literal Hebrew translation of master. You go to a master and you want to learn, right? That relationship is based on the quality of the information that is attained, the effort of the student, and the skill of the teacher in giving the student the information, and not just the information, but the moral direction and the path in life, etc., that they too can one day become a master. Right? That's how these religions like this work. On the other hand, you have an idea that Abraham basically invented or had an inkling of, that the relationship with God can be more inherent to the person than what they study or what they learn. In other words, the relationship with God is not just something you do, it's something you can be. And if it's something that you really are, why couldn't you give it over to your child if they're inheriting from you? If the child inherits from the father, as we say in Chassidus always, Yafe keach haben mekeach ha'av. The son has the capacities of the father, and even more so. He reflects even the hidden capacities that the father didn't even know he had. Right? The son is an expression of the father's deepest potential. So in that sense, if the relationship with God is not something that you learn, but rather something you can fundamentally be at the deepest level of your being, why couldn't you transmit that to your son? Right? Just by him being your son. This is the idea that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob collectively, a father, a son, and a grandson, right, together, instilled within the Jewish nation. And God basically gave them their desire. God gave them the stamp. In other words, God said, because you attain this relationship with me, where godliness is not something that you do, but something that you are, I will pass on that godliness as something that you are to all of your descendants for all time. That will be something that is bequeathed by you to all generations. They'll inherit from you forever. This thing where there is an inner reality, where an inner place where godliness is not what you do but what you are, is called the godly soul in Chassidus. Which immediately tells you it's not something you can learn. It's not something you acquire. It's not something you work to have. It's something that is your inheritance. You have it because you're a Jew. To the extent that you're a Jew, which is in Torah would explain that's the very deepest part of your being, the deepest part of your reality is that you're a Jew. It's far more real than your biological being as a human animal, right? And that deepest identity as a Jew, the Jew is the relationship with God. And this is inherited from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Animal soul, godly soul. So, a Jew has two things, right? That's why Jews are so strange and confused. We're strange and confused because we have not just two different tendencies. Every human being has a tendency that pulls them downward and a tendency that pulls them upward, because the human being is a very refined animal, and even a very coarse human being has moments where they can very easily transcend their animal nature. A human being is the type of animal that has the ability to stop being an animal to a certain extent, even just the animal soul, I'm saying, by dint of what we are, because we have a seichel and an intellect, and we have free choice, these things that give us the ability to stand apart from our pure animal nature. The Jew doesn't just have two tendencies. He doesn't just have the tendency that pulls outward and downward to death, which is the pure animal tendency, and the tendency which pulls him upward and inward towards true reality and the truth, which is the good half of the animal tendency, right? He has a totally different other reality that's not above or below. It's literally on the side. A Jew has something that is not none of this. In other words, on the whole spectrum to good, from good to evil, physical to spiritual, right, death to life, on that whole spectrum, you will never run into the godly soul. The godly soul is this other thing, right? The godly soul, which by this description you should realize, is not something that is encountered consciously very often by a Jew. Right? It's not something a Jew is in touch with very often. A Jew has a place within them where they are, not do or feel, they are a totally different being who their entire being is just their relationship with God. And that other being, that godly soul within the Jew that is our inheritance from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob according to the Torah, can influence and can affect, although usually not in a conscious way or a way that it's experienced necessarily, it has a powerful effect on the Jew's reality. When do we see the godly soul's experience directly? Right? It's the famous example given in Tanya. I think there would be other examples. I don't think it's the only time, but it's the famous example given in Tanya. What is the experience of the godly soul? It's an interesting question. The experience of the godly soul, it doesn't have a quality, right? It's not something it doesn't feel like anything because it's beyond feeling. It's not animal, right? It's not the animal within the animal vitality. So it doesn't taste like a pizza or an ice cream. It doesn't have a feeling of elation like love. It doesn't have a feeling of depression. It's not a feeling at all. It's also not an idea. It's not a concept, right? It's something else. So what could the experience of something else be like? It's almost like a riddle or a paradox, right? What does it mean to experience the, by definition, inexperienceable, the, by definition, non-animal, non-biological experience? So the Alter Rebbe says you find a fascinating historical phenomenon. Many religions have martyrs. Many religions have people that die for their beliefs. It's very common, and even non-religions. Other belief systems, ideologies, people die for family, there's all sorts of things that people are more important to people than their life. And they give their life for this cause or this person or this thing. Many such cases. What you find an interesting historical phenomenon among Jews, that Jews who otherwise have no appreciation for Judaism really, who are not very observant, who don't care about the Torah or the mitzvahs, who don't care about God, they don't have a relationship with God, they don't daven, they don't put on tefillin, they don't light Shabbos candles, they don't come to shul, they're not interested, they don't live with the Jewish community, maybe they wouldn't even be buried with the Jewish community, they have no real affiliation. Jews like that, historically, have rather died than worship idols or converted to other religions. That, says the Alter Rebbe, is the effect of the pure godly soul. And at the time of the choice, it's not a feeling. It's what's described in Yiddish as a zoi und nit andrisch. This way, and it can't be any other way. In other words, or as it's quoted in the Hayyomim, as the Alter Rebbe said, a Yid nitter will und nitter ken sein abgerissen von Elikus, which means a Jew does not want and cannot be separated from godliness. In the experience when that Jew, who's historically hundreds and thousands of cases, a Jew who has no real particular interest in Judaism, this is not, in other words, other religions, their martyrs are very religious. Right? The Muslims on 9/11 from Al-Qaeda were all, one thing you could say about them is they're very religious. Right? Passionate, devoted to their cause. That's what a martyr is. Right? Jews, by the hundreds and thousands throughout history, have had unpassionate, uninvolved, on the surface, uninterested martyrs. Right? You come to a Jew who's barely doing anything Jewish with their life anyway, and you say, as was unfortunately said to Jews throughout Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years, you tell them, listen, you either convert to Christianity, or as the saying goes, they would come to them with a cross in one hand and a sword in the other, and they would say, either you kiss this or this kisses you. Right? That was the option. And Jews who were non-observant, non-interested, not devoted, not passionate, by the hundreds and by the thousands, chose the sword rather than the cross. And the experience at that moment was not a feeling. It was just the cognizance that I can do nothing else. In other words, it wasn't something that they did or that they felt or that they thought. It was something that they are. What I am is a Jew. What I am is my relationship with God. And I cannot give that up. Cannot in the sense of like physically impossible, right? Like the famous saying goes, if someone asks me to jump off a bridge, maybe, but to jump onto a bridge is a whole other matter, right? Jump off a bridge, you just have to be very brave and willing to sacrifice yourself. Jump onto a bridge, physically impossible, right? This is like jumping onto a bridge, right? To give up godliness, right, is something that a Jew can't do. Now, how come then in their regular lives they weren't observant, right? And they had no interest really in Judaism and in godliness? And the answer is because rarely are we given the opportunity and the merit to see things so clearly, where you have a single choice where all of Judaism is on the one hand, and giving up all of Judaism is on the other hand. This great merit of being able to stand up for the name of God and to have self-sacrifice for Judaism is not a merit that a lot of people get. Very often, which in a sense is maybe a good thing. Probably a good thing. But the thing is that most of our lives, it's never so simple. Most of our lives, we convince ourselves that if I don't put on tefillin, it's not like I've kissed a cross. God forbid, are you insane? Right? Not putting on tefillin one day, not going to shul, not keeping a mitzvah. It's not like I'm taking up a different religion, right? It's just whatever. I'm busy, other things, right? And we convince ourselves. And the Alter Rebbe's point in Tanya is that if a Jew could see the way a tzaddik sees, the way a Rebbe sees, that every such decision is in a little way like kissing that cross, that would give every Jew the strength to live a passionate life in the service of God and never leaving that service. In other words, if you could attain that clarity of vision, that this is what's actually going on when I have my own when I make my own decisions apart from what God wants, right? In other words, when I deny that what I am is my relationship with God, if I could see that what I was doing in some small way was going against my true nature, if I had that clarity, then the Jew would fundamentally never do anything that was against God's will. And the Alter Rebbe says that every Jew has this capacity. There's no Jew who's ever been born who doesn't have this inner wherewithal to ultimately see that their entire reality is just their relationship with God. Now, this leads to a very interesting question, which is, that's not the most interesting question in a sense. The reason we don't see it, I just explained it to you, because we're confused. That's why. We don't see it because the world is a place of doubled and redoubled darkness, deep and profound exile. You know the story of the Maggid of Mezrich, where his son or child came up to the Maggid of Mezrich and was crying, and he says, "Why are you crying?" The child tells him, "I'm crying because we were playing hide and seek, and I was hiding away, and I was such a good hider. I hid myself away so well that eventually everyone else gave up, and they didn't even come looking for me. They looked for me for a while, and then they gave up. They don't look for me anymore." And the Maggid of Mezrich burst into tears, and he turned his eyes toward heaven, and he said, "Finally I understand how you feel God. You hid yourself away so well that everyone's forgotten that this whole game is just looking for you. And they've all gone off and wandered to do their own thing." So we're basically like the kid who got bored. That's who we are. We're the kid who got bored and are off doing other things. I don't know, investing in Bitcoin. We're doing other things. We're distracted. We forgot that that's what the game's all about, right? But that's why we're here. That's what our mimer is about. This discourse says that if you really think well every day about the true nature of reality, this won't be your issue. You won't be able to be distracted by small worldly distractions inside things. On the contrary, you will find no peace for yourself in any of that. You'll truly want godliness. You'll want the true reality. When a human being sees that what he has been involved in is not the ultimate truth, is to some extent fake or less, that there's something more, their inherent nature is to want it. What was I saying? The question. The question is like this. We've said what the godly soul is, right? Interestingly. We said the animal soul's biological life, whatever that means, right? In other words, we say it's the thing that makes you alive. All right, fine. The godly soul, we've described very profoundly what it is. What it is the relationship with God. It is to be the relationship with God, or as the Alter Rebbe puts it in the second chapter of Tanya, the godly soul is literally a piece of God, or a spark of God, whatever that means. Right? What does it mean to be an animal soul? Which is a weird question. Most of our lives, most of us, what we are is an animal soul, is a biological soul. What does it mean to be an animal soul? In other words, the experience of the godly soul, what am I? The answer is I'm a relationship with God, or I'm a piece of God, if you want to take the direct language of Tanya. When you ask someone, but what's it like to be an animal soul? What's it like to be alive? Right? Just as a regular human being. The answer doesn't seem so obvious, right? It doesn't seem so clear. You could cop out, you could say that isn't that what every writer, poet, artist, painter, sculptor, isn't that what everyone has been trying to capture for thousands of years and no one has ever fully captured it? What does it mean to be alive? I don't know. Our mimer, our discourse, gives an answer. And the truth is, we discussed this in an earlier class, one of these classes, when we were learning our mimer of the previous Rebbe about davening. We had a whole class where we discussed this concept. So we're going to bring it up again, because it's in our mimer as well. It's in our discourse. To be an animal soul is to be a ratzon, is to be a will. That's what the animal soul is. The animal soul wants. What does it mean to want? There's a fundamental difference between God and everyone else when it comes to wanting. God can want even when... The truth is that I see no reason to be so categorical. The godly soul can do this as well. I don't know, so it's not the difference between God and everyone else. The problem is that what you realize when you learn Chassidus for long enough is that the reason the soul can do this is just because it's a piece of God. So in other words, in one sense, it is only God who can do this. In another sense, the godly soul can do it as well because it's a piece of God. So it's only God who can do this. Right? It's not. You understand what I'm saying? It's not.